When telling a story, how do you present it? It's a pretty silly question, isn't it? It completely depends on what the story's about and how it relates to yourself and the people listening to it. You wouldn't tell a story to your friends about your ex without villainizing them on some level, and you wouldn't defame yourself in a story about an accident you got yourself into. In a sense, you are framing your story in order to solicit a wanted reaction from whoever's listening. This is exactly what journalists do when they present a story which, on a small scale, is a banal and trivial fact. However, on a larger scale, the consequences are stark. In recent times, people have become more polarized and angrier than ever before in the arena of public opinion. This is because the framing of modern news stories is overt and agendaed due to the demands of the internet. Media theorist Gary Linnell argued that in an increasingly digitized world, media organizations will need to hook audiences over a long period of time and therefore will need to create large meta-narratives about the state of affairs, making every news story sensational. Can, however, overcome this by becoming media literate alongside understanding and being able to identify the common frames of storytelling inside and outside of Facebook. To understand how media can be framed, we must ensure that we know what framing is. Irving Goffman, the sociologist who created frame analysis, articulated that framing is the way a communication source defines and constructs any piece of information. He further discerned that we can analyze these conceptual frames and realize the structure of an individual's perception of society. Goffman followed this by dividing framing into two overarching categories. The first category is primary frames, which is defined as the product of a larger culture and shared by all within a culture. An example of this might be Fox News referencing the ideals of liberty and freedom in order to stoke patriotic pride. The next type of frame you might see in the news is the fabricated frame, which transforms a culturally constructed social reality to play or deceive. An example of this might include a politician announcing a war on a perceived social evil, like drugs or terror. You can further disseminate frames into smaller narrative frames which are used in news to influence the perspective from which the news story is being told. The first narrative frame to look out for is the conflict frame, which typically pits two subjects of a story against one another in order to drive the narrative of disunity. An example of this might be Fox News' online article following Kamala Harris becoming the Democratic vice presidential nominee, with the headline saying that Joe Biden is setting aside tensions from primary, and besides this being grammatically questionable, Fox is suggesting that the pair are not compatible for running mates, as in a primary debate over a year ago, Kamala Harris challenged Biden. But the irrelevancy of this fact doesn't seem to matter because Fox is attempting to create a meta-narrative that the Democratic option is deficient to a Republican option come election time. The next narrative frame we ought to analyze is the human interest frame, which involves news journalists focusing on an issue through the lens of a normal everyday person. This frame conceptualizes an issue and aims to make said issue more relatable and real. The problem with the human interest frame is the evidence is anecdotal and usually only reflects the general viewpoint already espoused by the news organization, thereby legitimizing their narratives. The next commonly used narrative frame is the economic consequences frame, which focuses on statistics and economic factors in order to propagate an argument that an action being undertaken is either going to create prosperity or shrinkage in various forms. A negative use of this frame might focus on additional taxes in order to paint a policy proposal as burdensome and reckless. Meanwhile, the moral narrative frame appeals to an audience's ethics and may attempt to make the audience create value judgments based off of their embedded knowledge and personal dogmas. It appeals to the emotions of the audience, which directly leads to irrational conclusions on a given topic, as Daniel Kahneman found when he upended the general economic notion that human beings were completely rational creatures by showing just how irrational we can be when emotions are involved. Therefore, if a journalist can make you feel happy, sad, angry, or all of the above, then they can convince you that their narrative is paramount. Finally, media theorist Helen Fulton determined that when analyzing journalistic text, we ought to be aware of the semantic functions at play, as this can reveal the relationship between the author and the receiver. An example of this is CNN's The Point article following Kamala Harris being announced as Joe Biden's running mate. Chris Chileza writes in first person, suggesting that he is attempting to remove the frame of prestige he may have as the text producer, thereby making the audience more placid to the ideas being communicated. Congratulations, you are now media literate. You have bravely taken the red pill and now see the only thing you can trust is that, regardless of the rhetoric, you will still have to pay tax. Just make sure it's for the right thing.